The old Honda Civic sputtered to a stop in the parking lot of the Riverside Community Center. Elena Rodriguez sat behind the wheel for a moment, staring at the large brick building through her cracked windshield. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, and she could already see people walking in and out of the main entrance, carrying music bags and instrument cases. She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror one more time. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a plain blue polo shirt with Riverside Cleaning Services embroidered on the pocket. The shirt was a little too big for her small frame, but it was clean and professional looking. That's what mattered most. Elena grabbed her small lunch bag from the passenger seat and stepped out of the car. The autumn air was crisp, and she pulled her thin cardigan tighter around her shoulders. At 43, she had learned to dress in layers. The community center was always either too hot or too cold, depending on which room she was cleaning, walking. Toward the employee entrance, she noticed a group of well-dressed people gathering near the main doors. They were talking excitedly about something, their voices carrying across the parking lot. These were the kind of people who belonged here, Elena thought to herself. People who had time for art classes and music lessons, people who didn't have to worry about making rent every month. The employee entrance was around the back of the building, next to the loading dock. Elena had been working here for exactly 3 weeks now, and she still felt like an outsider. The other cleaning staff were friendly enough, but most of them spoke very little English. Elena's English was good, but she kept to herself anyway. It was easier that way. She punched her time card and grabbed her cleaning cart from the supply closet. The cart was heavy and one of the wheels squeaked terribly, but she had learned to navigate the hallways without making too much noise. The community center was busy during the day, with classes and activities happening in almost every room. Her first stop was always the main lobby. The floors were marble, which looked beautiful but showed every footprint and smudge. Elena had perfected her technique for mopping them without leaving streaks. She worked methodically, starting from the far corner and working her way toward the entrance dot. As she cleaned, people walked past her constantly. Some nodded politely, others didn't seem to notice her at all. Elena preferred the ones who didn't notice. It meant she could do her job without interruption, without having to make small talk about the weather or pretend to smile. When she didn't feel like it, the sound of piano music drifted from one of the rooms down the hallway. Elena paused in her mopping, listening to the melody. It was beautiful, but the person playing was struggling with a particular passage. They kept stopping and starting, trying to get it right. Elena recognized the piece immediately, though she couldn't remember the composer's name. The melody was etched in her memory from years ago, from a different life. She shook her head and continued mopping. That was the past? This was her reality now. Finishing the lobby, Elena made her way to the classrooms. Most of them were empty at this hour, which made her job easier. She could clean quickly and efficiently without having to work around people. The art rooms were always the messiest, with paint splatters and bits of clay scattered everywhere. The meeting rooms were usually just dusty, with coffee rings on the tables and forgotten papers in the trash cans, but the music rooms were different. They were treated with a kind of reverence that Elena found both beautiful and heartbreaking. The instruments were carefully maintained, the sheet music was organized perfectly, and even the furniture was positioned just so. These rooms felt sacred, like churches dedicated to the worship of sound and melody. The piano room was her favorite and least favorite room to clean. Favorite because it was always spotless, requiring little more than dusting and vacuuming. Least favorite because of the memories it stirred up. Memories she had spent years trying to forget. The grand piano dominated the center of the room, its black surface polished to a mirror shine. Elena had learned to clean around it carefully, never touching the keys, never lifting the lid to dust the strings inside. She treated it like a sleeping giant that she didn't want to wake up. Today, as she dusted the music stands and straightened the chairs, she could hear voices approaching in the hallway. The door to the piano room was open, and she recognized the voices of the piano teachers. They were discussing something about a recital, their voices carrying the authority of people who were used to being in charge. Elena tried to work faster, hoping to finish before they entered the room. She didn't like being around when the teachers, or having their meetings or lessons. They were polite enough, but she could feel their eyes on her sometimes, as if they were wondering what someone like her was doing in their refined world of classical music. The teachers entered the room just as Elena was finishing with the last music stand. There were 3 of them, all middle-aged and well-dressed. The man, who seemed to be in charge, was wearing a tweed jacket with patches on the elbows. The 2 women were dressed in the kind of elegant, understated clothing that Elena associated with old money and good breeding. They nodded politely as they passed her, already deep in conversation about fingering techniques and interpretation. Elena gathered her cleaning supplies and tried to make herself invisible as she prepared to leave the room, but something made her stop. The man in the tweed jacket was playing a section of music on the piano, demonstrating something to the other teachers. His technique was adequate, but Elena could hear the mistakes. The timing was slightly off, the dynamics were wrong, and he was rushing through the difficult passages instead of taking time to let them breathe. She found herself listening more intently than she should have, her hands still on her cleaning cart, but her attention completely focused on the music. The piece was one she knew well, one she had performed many times in her younger days. She could play it with her eyes closed, could feel the way each note should flow into the next. The teacher finished playing, and the 3 of them began discussing the piece. Elena could hear them analyzing the technical challenges, debating the best way to teach it to their students. They were knowledgeable, certainly, but there was something academic about their approach that bothered her. They were talking about the music as if it were a mathematical equation to be solved, rather than a living, breathing expression of human emotion. Elena pushed her cart toward the door, but one of the wheels chose that moment to squeak particularly loudly. All 3 teachers turned to look at her, and she felt her face flush with embarrassment. The man in the tweed jacket smiled at her. It was a kind smile, but also slightly patronizing, the way adults smile at children who are trying to be helpful. As Elena left the room, she could still hear the music in her head. Her fingers twitched slightly, remembering the feel of the keys, the weight of each note, the way the melody could transport both player and listener to another world entirely. She had work to do. Bills to pay, responsibilities to meet, a life to live that had nothing to do with music or dreams or the person she used to be. But as she pushed her squeaky cart down the hallway, the melody followed her, a ghost from her past that refused to be silenced. 3 weeks had passed since Elena's first day at the community center, and she had settled into a comfortable routine. She arrived every morning at 7, cleaned the lobby first, then worked her way through the classrooms and offices. The piano room was always her last stop, partly because it required the least work, and partly because she found herself drawn to the music that often filled the space. The piano teachers had grown accustomed to seeing her around. They would nod politely when she passed them in the hallways, and sometimes they would pause their conversations until she finished cleaning their room. Elena appreciated their consideration, even though it made her feel somewhat invisible. On this particular Wednesday morning, Elena was running slightly behind schedule. Her car had trouble starting, and she had to wait for her neighbor to give her a jump. By the time she reached the piano room, the teachers were already there, setting up for their morning staff meeting. Professor Williams, the department head with the tweed jacket, was arranging sheet music on the piano. Mrs. Chun, a petite woman in her 50s who always wore pearls, was preparing tea on the small table in the corner. The 3rd teacher, Mrs. Patterson, was a tall woman with gray hair who had a reputation for being both strict and fair with her students. Elena tried to slip into the room quietly with her cleaning cart, but the squeaky wheel betrayed her again. All 3 teachers looked up from their preparations. "Good morning, Elena," Professor Williams said with a warm smile. "Please, don't mind us. We're just having our weekly meeting." Elena nodded and began dusting the windowsills, trying to be as quiet as possible. She had learned that if she worked slowly and carefully, she could often finish her tasks while overhearing interesting conversations about music and teaching. Today's discussion centered around the upcoming community recital. The teachers were concerned about finding enough advanced students to fill the program. Many of their adult students were beginners or intermediate players who weren't ready for public performance. "We need at least 3 more pieces," Mrs. Chun was saying, stirring her tea thoughtfully. "Something challenging enough to showcase real talent, but not so difficult that it intimidates our audience. What about the Chopin nocturnes?" Mrs. Patterson suggested. "They're beautiful and accessible." Professor Williams shook his head. "Too common. Everyone expects Chopin at these events. We need something that will surprise people, show them that our program is serious about musical excellence." Elena continued her dusting, but her ears perked up at the mention of challenging pieces. She had performed in many recitals during her conservatory days, and she remembered the excitement of preparing for those performances, the way the music would consume her thoughts for weeks beforehand. "What about the Chopin Ballade No. 1? Professor Williams continued, pulling out a thick book of sheet music. "It's technically demanding, emotionally rich, and not something you hear every day." Mrs. Chun looked doubtful. "That's a very difficult piece. None of our current students are ready for something that advanced." Perhaps we should consider a different approach," Mrs. Patterson suggested. "Maybe focus on ensemble pieces or simpler works that can be performed with more expression." Elena found herself slowing down her dusting, listening more intently to their conversation. The Chopin Ballade No. 1 was indeed a challenging piece, but it was also one of the most beautiful works ever written for piano. She had performed it several times during her student days, and even now, years later, she could still hear every note in her mind. As she worked, Elena noticed that she was unconsciously moving her fingers, playing the opening phrases of the ballade on the windowsill. The muscle memory was still there. Even after all these years of silence, Professor Williams noticed her lingering near the piano and smiled. "Elena, I hope we're not keeping you from your work with all our chatter about music." Elena looked up, startled. "No, sir. I'm almost finished." "You seem interested in our discussion," Mrs. Chun observed kindly. "Do you enjoy music?" Elena felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. Yes, I like music. Have you ever played piano?" Mrs. Patterson asked, her tone curious but not condescending. Elena hesitated. This was dangerous territory. "A little," she said carefully, "long time ago." The 3 teachers exchanged glances, and Elena could see the wheels turning in their minds. Professor Williams had a particular expression that she had learned to recognize over the past few weeks. It was the look he got when he was about to make what he considered a generous gesture. "Would you like to try playing something?" he asked, gesturing toward the piano. "It's wonderful that you have some musical background. So many people think piano is beyond their reach." Elena felt her pulse quicken. "Oh, no, I couldn't. I haven't played in years." "Nonsense," Mrs. Chun said encouragingly. "It's like riding a bicycle. Once you learn, you never really forget." Elena looked at the piano, its polished surface reflecting the morning light from the windows. Part of her wanted to refuse, to make some excuse about needing to finish her work. But another part of her, a part that had been dormant for too long, was awakening. "Maybe something simple?" she said, surprising herself with her words. Professor Williams beamed. "Excellent! What would you like to play? For Elise, perhaps, or maybe the entertainer?" Elena could hear the assumption in his voice. He was thinking of easy pieces, beginner music suitable for someone of her apparent background and education. She should have been offended, but instead she felt something else entirely. A spark of mischief, perhaps, or maybe just the desire to feel her fingers on the keys again. "Actually," she said, looking at the sheet music still spread across the piano, "could I try that piece you were just discussing? The Chopin?" The silence in the room was immediate and complete. The 3 teachers stared at her with expressions of surprise and concern. "Elena," Professor Williams said gently, "the Chopin Ballade is extremely difficult. Even advanced students struggle with it. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer something a bit more manageable?" Elena could hear the kindness in his voice, but also the doubt. They were trying to save her from embarrassment, trying to protect her from attempting something beyond her abilities. In their minds, she was a cleaning lady with perhaps A few years of childhood piano lessons. Not someone who could tackle one of the most challenging pieces in the classical repertoire. I understand it's difficult, Elena said quietly. But I'd like to try, if that's okay. Mrs. Patterson looked concerned. Elena, dear, we don't want you to feel frustrated. This piece has taken some of our most advanced students months to learn. And even then, Mrs. Chun added, they often struggle with the technical passages. It requires years of training to play properly. Elena looked at the three teachers, all of them well-meaning, all of them trying to manage her expectations. They had no way of knowing about her past, about the countless hours she had spent practicing, about the competitions she had won and the concerts she had performed. I'd still like to try, she said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. Professor Williams sighed, but his expression was kind. Very well, but please, don't feel bad if it doesn't go as you hope. This is one of the most challenging pieces ever written for piano. He handed her the sheet music, and Elena's hands trembled slightly as she took it. Not from nervousness about the music itself, but from the weight of what this moment represented. She was about to reveal a part of herself that she had kept hidden for years, a part that she had thought was buried forever. Take your time, Mrs. Chun said gently. And remember, we're just here to encourage you. Elena sat down at the piano bench and adjusted her position. The familiar weight of the keys beneath her fingers felt like coming home after a long journey. She placed her hands on the keyboard and took a deep breath. The three teachers settled into their chairs, their expressions a mixture of anticipation and barely concealed concern. They were expecting to hear a halting, amateur attempt at one of classical music's most demanding pieces. They had no idea what was about to happen. Elena sat at the piano bench, her hands resting lightly on the keys. The silence in the room was thick with anticipation and barely hidden concern. She could feel the three teachers watching her, their expressions a mixture of kindness and worry. They were preparing themselves to offer comfort. When she inevitably struggled with the piece, she looked down at the sheet music, though she didn't really need it. The Chopin Ballade No. 1 was embedded in her memory like a favorite poem, every note and phrase as familiar as her own heartbeat. But seeing it on paper brought back a flood of memories from 20 years ago. When she had first learned this piece at the conservatory in her home country, her fingers found their position on the keys, and for a moment she was transported back to her old practice room. She could almost smell the wood polish and hear the distant sound of other students practicing in neighboring rooms. Her teacher, Professor Dmitri, had been demanding but patient, pushing her to find the emotional core of every piece she played. This is not just notes on a page, he used to say. This is human experience translated into sound. You must find the story within the music. Elena took a deep breath and began to play. The opening notes were soft, almost tentative, like someone testing the waters of a familiar lake. The melody emerged from the piano with a warmth that filled the room, but Elena could feel the rust in her fingers, the slight hesitation that came from years of silence. The teachers exchanged glances. The opening was better than they had expected, but they knew the real challenges lay ahead. The Chopin Ballade started deceptively simply before building to moments of incredible technical and emotional complexity. As Elena continued through the first section, her confidence began to grow. The muscle memory was still there, buried beneath. Years of cleaning floors and wiping tables, but awakening with each passing measure. Her posture straightened, her breathing deepened, and her fingers began to move with more authority. Professor Williams leaned forward slightly in his chair. Something was happening that he hadn't expected. The cleaning lady's technique was not just adequate, it was sophisticated. Her understanding of the piece's structure was evident in the way she shaped each phrase, building toward the more dramatic sections with perfect timing. Mrs. Chun set down her teacup with a soft clink, her attention completely focused on Elena's performance. The younger woman's interpretation was deeply personal, filled with an emotion that couldn't be taught in any classroom. There was pain in her playing, but also hope, as if she were rediscovering a part of herself that had been lost. Elena reached The first technical passage, a section that required rapid fingerwork and perfect coordination between both hands. This was where most amateur players would stumble, where the limitations of casual piano study would become apparent. The teachers held their breath, waiting for the inevitable breakdown, but Elena's fingers danced across the keys with fluid precision. Her left hand provided a steady foundation while her right hand wove intricate patterns above it. The notes cascaded like water over stones, each one clear and perfectly placed. Her years of intensive training were showing themselves, breaking through the careful facade she had maintained for so long. Mrs. Patterson's eyes widened. She had been teaching piano for 30 years, and she recognized virtuoso-level playing when she heard it. This was not the work of someone who had taken a few childhood lessons. This was the playing of someone who had dedicated their life to mastering the instrument. As Elena moved into the more lyrical middle section of the piece, tears began to form in her eyes. The music was telling her own story, dreams pursued and then abandoned, love lost and found, the bittersweet nature of memory and hope. Her fingers found expression in every note, conveying emotions that words could never capture. The room had become completely still except for the sound of the piano. Professor Williams found himself holding his breath, mesmerized by what he was witnessing. This was not just good playing, this was artistry of the highest order. The cleaning lady he had barely noticed for 3 weeks was revealing herself to be a musician of extraordinary talent. Elena's hands moved with increasing confidence as she approached the piece's dramatic climax. The technical demands were enormous: rapid scales, complex rhythms, and dynamic contrasts that required perfect control. But Elena met each challenge with ease, her fingers flying across the keys with the precision of a master craftsman. The emotional intensity of the music seemed to flow through her entire body. She swayed slightly with the rhythm, her face reflecting the passion and pain embedded in Chopin's composition. This was no longer a demonstration or a test, this was a woman reconnecting with her true self through the language of music. Mrs. Chun wiped away a tear that had formed in the corner of her eye. She had heard this piece performed countless times, by students and professionals alike, but never with such raw emotional honesty. Elena was not just playing the notes, she was living them, breathing them, making them part of her own story. As the piece built toward its thunderous conclusion, Elena's playing became more powerful, more confident. Her years of hiding behind a simple uniform and a cleaning cart fell away, replaced by the commanding presence of a true artist. The piano responded to her touch like a willing partner, producing sounds that ranged from whisper-soft to gloriously triumphant. The final section of the ballade was a tour de force of pianistic writing, requiring stamina, technique, and musical understanding at the highest level. Elena attacked it with fearless intensity, her fingers navigating the complex passages with the ease of someone who had conquered this mountain many times before. Professor Williams found himself leaning forward in his chair, completely absorbed in the performance. He had studied this piece for years, had heard it performed by world-renowned pianists, but Elena's interpretation was revealing new depths in the music that he had never noticed before. As Elena approached the final measures, the 3 teachers realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. This was not just a surprising revelation of hidden talent, this was a masterclass in musical interpretation and technical excellence. The woman they had seen as a simple cleaning lady was demonstrating skills that surpassed many professional musicians. Elena's hands moved through the final dramatic gestures of the piece with absolute certainty. The last notes rang out in the room like a declaration, powerful and clear, and filled with the accumulated emotion of years of silence. As the sound faded into stillness, Elena sat motionless at the piano, her hands still on the keys, her eyes closed as if she were holding on to the last echoes of the music. The silence that followed was profound. The 3 teachers sat in stunned amazement, unable to process what they had just witnessed. The transformation they had observed was complete. The humble cleaning lady had revealed herself to be a pianist of extraordinary ability, someone whose talent belonged on the world's greatest stages. Elena slowly opened her eyes and looked at her hands on the keyboard. For a few precious minutes, She had been herself again, not the struggling immigrant working multiple jobs. Not the woman who cleaned floors and emptied trash cans, but the musician she had always been at heart. The feeling was both exhilarating and heartbreaking. She turned to face the teachers, her cheeks flushed with emotion and exertion. Their faces reflected a mixture of shock, admiration, and something that might have been shame. In that moment, all of them understood that their assumptions about her had been completely wrong. "Elena," Professor Williams whispered, his voice filled with awe, "where on earth did you learn to play like that?" Elena sat at the piano bench, her hands still trembling slightly from the performance. The three teachers stared at her with expressions of complete bewilderment. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few seconds. Finally, Professor Williams found his voice. "Elena," he said softly, I don't understand. Where did you learn to play like that?" Elena looked down at her hands, still resting on the keys. The question she had been dreading for 3 weeks had finally come. She had known this moment would arrive eventually, but she hadn't expected it to happen like this. She had imagined being discovered accidentally, perhaps humming a melody or unconsciously tapping out rhythms while she worked. "It's a long story," she said quietly. Mrs. Chen moved her chair closer to the piano. "We have time," she said gently. That was extraordinary, Elena. I've been teaching piano for 25 years, and I've rarely heard such beautiful playing." Elena felt tears forming in her eyes. She had forgotten what it felt like to be praised for her music, to be recognized as a musician rather than just someone who cleaned floors. The validation was overwhelming. "I grew up in Romania," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "My grandmother noticed that I had perfect pitch when I was very young. Whenever she hummed songs, I could play them back on her old upright piano without any mistakes." Professor Williams leaned forward, his academic curiosity overcoming his shock. "How young were you?" 3 years old, Elena replied. "My grandmother worked as a seamstress, but she had always loved music. She saved every penny she could to pay for my piano lessons." Mrs. Patterson shook her head in amazement. "Starting at 3 years old. That explains the natural technique we just witnessed." Elena nodded. "My first teacher was Mr. Vassal, an old man who had studied at the conservatory before the war. He was very strict, but he saw something in me. He taught me for free because my grandmother couldn't afford his regular rates." The memories came flooding back as Elena spoke. She could see Mr. Vassal's weathered hands demonstrating fingering techniques, could hear his voice explaining the emotional content of each piece. He had been like a grandfather to her, patient and demanding in equal measure. "When I was 12, Elena continued, Mr. Vassal arranged for me to audition at the National Music Conservatory in Bucharest. I was terrified, but I played 3 pieces from memory. They accepted me immediately and offered me a full scholarship." Mrs. Chun's eyes widened. "The conservatory in Bucharest? That's one of the most prestigious music schools in Eastern Europe." "It was the best 8 years of my life," Elena said, a smile crossing her face for the first time. "I studied with Professor Ionescu, who had been a student of the great masters. Every day was music from morning until night. We practiced 6 hours a day minimum." Professor Williams was trying to process this information. "So you received conservatory-level training. That explains your technical mastery. But Elena, what happened? How did you end up here?" Elena's smile faded. This was the difficult part of the story, the part that still caused her pain to remember. "I graduated when I was 20. I had won several competitions, and I was starting to perform professionally. I had a recording contract and was planning my first international tour." "That's incredible," Mrs. Patterson said. "You were living every musician's dream." "I was," Elena agreed. "But then I met Carlos. He was an American businessman working in Romania. We fell in love, and he asked me to marry him and move to America. I was young and foolish, and I thought love was more important than music." The 3 teachers could hear the regret in her voice. They had seen many talented young musicians abandon their careers for various reasons, but it was always heartbreaking to witness. "What happened when you came to America?" Mrs. Chun asked gently. Elena sighed deeply. Everything was different. Carlos had promised to help me continue my career here, but he didn't understand how difficult it would be. I didn't speak English. Well, I had no connections in the American music world, and my Romanian credentials didn't mean much here.
But surely you could have found students or joined a music program, Professor Williams suggested.
I tried, Elena said. But we moved to a small town in Texas where there wasn't much demand for classical piano. Carlos got a job at an oil company, and I was supposed to be the perfect housewife. I gave a few lessons to local children, but it wasn't enough to sustain me artistically. Elena paused, gathering her thoughts. The next part of the story was even more difficult to tell. After 2 years, I became pregnant with my daughter, Lisa. Carlos was thrilled, but the pregnancy was difficult. I had to stop teaching, and we were struggling financially. Carlos's job wasn't as stable as we had hoped. Mrs. Patterson reached over and squeezed Elena's hand. Being a mother changes everything, she said softly. When Lisa was born, I was completely focused on her, Elena continued. Carlos was working long hours, and I was alone with the baby most of the time. I was exhausted and homesick. I missed my grandmother terribly, and I missed my music even more. Did you try to keep playing? Mrs. Chun asked. Elena shook her head. We couldn't afford a piano. I would practice on the kitchen table, just moving my fingers and hearing the music in my head. Sometimes I would go to the local church and ask if I could use their piano, but I felt like I was begging for charity. The teachers were silent, understanding the tragedy of a gifted musician being separated from her instrument. When Lisa was 3, Carlos lost his job, Elena continued. The oil company was downsizing, and he couldn't find anything else in our small town. We had to move to Houston, where I started working as a house cleaner to help pay the bills. How did you learn to speak English so well? Professor Williams asked. Television, Elena said with a small laugh. I watched soap operas and game shows while I cleaned houses. I was determined to give Lisa a better life than I had, and I knew that meant mastering English. What happened to your marriage? Mrs. Patterson asked softly. Elena's expression grew sad. Carlos became bitter about his career disappointments. He started drinking more, and he blamed me for our financial problems. He said I was too educated, too European, that I made him feel inadequate. When Lisa was 7, he left us for another woman. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Chun said. It was actually a relief, Elena admitted. I was tired of pretending to be someone I wasn't. But suddenly, I was a single mother with no real job skills except cleaning and some piano knowledge that seemed useless in the real world. You must have been terrified, Professor Williams said. I was, Elena agreed, but I was also determined. I took on more cleaning jobs, and I started working at night so I could be home when Lisa got back from school. I cleaned offices, restaurants, anywhere that would hire me. Did you ever think about returning to music? Mrs. Chun asked. Elena nodded. Every day. I bought a small digital keyboard at a thrift store, and I would play quietly at night after Lisa went to bed. I taught myself to use headphones so I wouldn't disturb the neighbors. It wasn't the same as playing a real piano, but it kept my fingers moving. Your daughter must be proud of your talent, Mrs. Patterson said. Elena smiled genuinely for the first time during the conversation. Lisa is now 22 and studying to be a nurse. She's always known about my musical background, but she's never seen me perform seriously. She thinks I'm just someone who used to play piano as a hobby. Why didn't you tell her the truth? Professor Williams asked. Because I was ashamed, Elena said honestly. I felt like I had wasted my talent, that I had let everyone down. My grandmother sacrificed so much for my education, and I threw it away for a man who didn't even appreciate me. The 3 teachers sat in stunned silence, processing Elena's story. Here was a woman who had achieved the highest levels of musical training, who had been on the verge of an international career, now working as a cleaning lady because life had taken unexpected turns. Elena, Mrs. Chun said finally, you didn't waste your talent. You've been protecting it, keeping it alive through all these difficult years. What we just heard proves that your gift is still there, stronger than ever. Elena looked at the 3 teachers, seeing something in their faces that she hadn't seen in years: respect, admiration, and genuine caring. For the first time in decades, she felt like she was being seen as the person she really was, not just the role she had been forced to play. After Elena finished telling her story, the piano room fell silent except for the soft ticking of the wall clock. The three teachers sat quietly, absorbing everything they had learned about the woman they had barely noticed for 3 weeks. Professor Williams was the first to speak. "Elena," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "I owe you an apology. We all do. We made assumptions about you based on your job, and we were completely wrong." Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "You don't need to apologize. You had no way of knowing." Mrs. Chun leaned forward in her chair. "But that's exactly the point. We should have treated you with more respect from the beginning, regardless of what we thought we knew about your background. What matters now," Mrs. Patterson added, "is what we do next. Elena, your talent is extraordinary. It would be a crime to let it remain hidden." Elena looked down at her hands, still resting on the piano keys. "I appreciate your kindness, but I have responsibilities. I need this job to pay my bills. I can't afford to chase dreams anymore." Professor Williams stood up and began pacing around the room, his mind racing with possibilities. "What if we could offer you something better? Elena, we've been struggling to find qualified instructors for our advanced students. Most of our teachers, myself included, are academics who learned from books and other teachers, but you learned from master musicians. You have performance experience that none of us can match." Elena shook her head. "I don't have any teaching credentials. I never studied education or pedagogy." "The best musicians often make the best teachers," Mrs. Chun said. "Credentials can be earned, but what you have inside you can't be taught in any university." Mrs. Patterson pulled out her phone and started scrolling through something. "Elena, the community center has been looking for ways to expand our music program. We've had requests from adult students who want more advanced instruction, but we haven't been able to meet that demand. What are you suggesting?" Elena asked, though she could feel her heart beginning to race with possibility. Professor Williams stopped pacing and turned to face her. "We want to offer you a position as a piano instructor. Part-time to start, teaching adults who are serious about advancing their skills. The pay would be better than cleaning, and you'd be doing what you were born to do." Elena felt dizzy. I don't know if I remember how to teach. And what about my cleaning job? I can't risk losing steady income." "We understand your concerns," Mrs. Chun said gently. "But we have a proposal. What if you continued your cleaning job for now, but started teaching just a few hours a week? You could see how it goes, build up a student base, and then gradually transition." "The community center board meets next week," Mrs. Patterson added, checking her phone. "If you're willing, we'd like to present this opportunity to them. But first, would you be willing to give a demonstration? Show them what we witnessed today?" Elena's mind was spinning. After 20 years of hiding her talent, the possibility of returning to music seemed both thrilling and terrifying. "What? If I'm not good enough anymore, what if I've forgotten too much?" Professor Williams laughed, though not unkindly. "Elena, what we just heard was better than most professional pianists. You haven't forgotten anything. If anything, your experiences have added depth to your playing that most young musicians lack." "But what about my daughter? I need to be able to support her college expenses." "Teaching piano pays well here," Mrs. Chun assured her. "Our advanced instructors earn more per hour than most cleaning jobs pay in a week. And you'd be building something sustainable, something you could continue for decades." Elena looked around the room that had become so familiar to her over the past 3 weeks. She thought about all the mornings she had spent cleaning this space, listening to music and remembering her old life. The idea that she might actually belong here, not as invisible help, but as a respected teacher, seemed like an impossible dream. "There's something else," Mrs. Patterson said softly. "The spring recital we were discussing earlier, we'd love for you to perform in it. Show the community what real artistry looks like." "I couldn't perform publicly," Elena said quickly. "I haven't performed for an audience in over 20 years. But you were performing today," Professor Williams pointed out. For us, and it was magnificent. Elena realized he was right. While she had been playing, she hadn't been thinking about her audience or her fears. She had been lost in the music, connected to that part of herself that had never really disappeared. I need time to think about this, Elena said finally. Of course, Mrs. Chung replied. This is a big decision. But Elena, please don't let fear hold you back. The world needs to hear what you have to offer. Over the next week, Elena found herself unable to concentrate on her cleaning duties. The teacher's offer replayed constantly in her mind. She found herself staying late in the piano room, playing softly when she thought no one was around. Each time she touched the keys, she felt more confident, more like herself. The word about Elena's talent had spread quietly through the community center. Other staff members began looking at her differently, with curiosity and respect. Some approached her with shy questions about music, and Elena found herself giving impromptu lessons during her breaks. On Friday afternoon, Mrs. Chun found Elena cleaning the music room and approached her with a warm smile. Elena, I have something to show you. She handed her a piece of paper. These are applications from people who want to study piano with you. Word has gotten out about your performance last week. Elena looked at the papers in disbelief. But I haven't even decided if I'm going to teach. People heard about what happened through their friends on the staff. They're excited about the possibility of learning from someone with your background. That evening, Elena sat at her small digital keyboard at home, thinking about her conversation with the teachers. She played through the Chopin Ballade again, and this time she could hear something different in her playing. It wasn't just technically proficient anymore, it was alive with possibility. Her daughter, Lisa, came home from her nursing school clinical rotations and found Elena at the keyboard. Mom, you seem different lately, happier. Elena looked up at her daughter, this beautiful young woman she had raised through so many struggles. Lisa, there's something I need to tell you about my past, about who I used to be. As Elena shared her story with her daughter, she saw pride and amazement growing in Lisa's eyes. Mom, why didn't you ever tell me you were a professional musician? Because I was ashamed that I had given it up, Elena admitted. But you didn't give it up, Lisa said firmly. You chose to be my mother instead, and that was the most important thing you could do. But now, now maybe it's time for both of our dreams. The next Monday, Elena walked into the community center with a new sense of purpose. She found Professor Williams in his office and knocked on the door. Elena, he said, looking up with a hopeful expression. I've made my decision, she said. I want to try teaching, part-time at first like you suggested. Professor Williams broke into a huge smile. That's wonderful news. And the recital? Elena took a deep breath. I think it's time for me to stop hiding. Yes, I'll perform in the recital. 6 months later, Elena stood backstage at the community center's annual spring recital. She was wearing a simple black dress, not expensive but elegant and appropriate for the occasion. Through the curtain, she could see the audience filling the auditorium. Her daughter Lisa sat in the front row. Beaming with pride, Elena now taught 15 students, ranging from serious adult beginners to advanced players preparing for competitions. She had earned enough to reduce her cleaning hours to just 2 days a week, and she was already making plans to transition completely to teaching, but tonight was about more than her new career. Tonight was about reclaiming her identity as a musician, about showing the world that talent and dreams don't have expiration dates. As Professor Williams introduced her to the audience, Elena walked onto the stage and sat at the grand piano, the same piano she had cleaned around for weeks, never imagining she would one day perform on it. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play the Chopin Ballade No. 1. But this time, she wasn't just playing for 3 surprised teachers. She was playing for everyone who had ever been underestimated, everyone who had hidden their talents out of necessity, everyone who thought it was too late to pursue their dreams. The music filled the auditorium with its complex beauty, and Elena knew that she was finally, truly home.